Oh man, Platoon, this is one of the most intense and gripping war movies ever made. Directed by Oliver Stone, who actually fought in Vietnam, it's a raw and unflinching look at the horrors of war and how it affects the soldiers caught up in it. It's not just about battles, though, it's about morality, brotherhood, and the personal toll that war takes on everyone involved. The story is told through the eyes of Chris Taylor, played by Charlie Sheen, a young, idealistic soldier who volunteers to fight in Vietnam. Right away, you can tell he's in over his head. He arrives in the jungle, and it's pure chaos, the heat, the exhaustion, the fear. You can feel how unprepared he is, both physically and mentally. He thought he'd come to fight for his country, but what he finds is something way more brutal and complex. The platoon Chris joins is made up of soldiers who've been in Vietnam for a while, and they're divided into two camps, led by two very different sergeants. On one side, there's Sergeant Elias, played by Willem Dafoe, who's compassionate, wise, and genuinely cares about the men under his command. He's the moral center of the group, trying to keep his humanity in the midst of all the violence. On the other side is Sergeant Barnes, played by Tom Berenger, who's cold, ruthless, and hardened by the war. He believes that survival is all that matters, no matter the cost. The real tension in the movie comes from the conflict between these two sergeants, which mirrors the larger conflict Chris is going through. Elias represents the part of Chris that still believes in right and wrong, while Barnes represents the darker, more cynical side that war is forcing him to confront. The platoon itself is split between these two leaders, with some soldiers following Elias's moral path and others becoming more brutal under Barnes's influence. One of the most powerful scenes comes when the platoon is sent on a mission to root out the Viet Cong in a small village. The soldiers, pushed to their limits by fear and rage, end up committing horrible atrocities. This is where you really see the moral breakdown happening, especially in Barnes, who executes a villager in cold blood. Chris, horrified by what he's seeing, starts to realize that the real enemy might not just be the Viet Cong, it might be the war itself, or even the men he's fighting alongside. But the movie isn't just about the horrors of war, it's also about loyalty and betrayal. There's this intense moment where Barnes and Elias have a face-off, and Barnes ends up shooting Elias in cold blood, leaving him for dead in the jungle. This leads to one of the most iconic shots in film history, Elias, wounded and betrayed, running through the jungle with his arms raised as he's gunned down by the enemy. That image of Elias, arms stretched out, has become a symbol of sacrifice and loss. As the movie goes on, Chris becomes more and more disillusioned. He starts to hate Barnes for what he's done, and he's torn apart by guilt over his own role in the war. The final confrontation between Chris and Barnes is brutal. Chris ultimately chooses to kill Barnes, symbolizing his rejection of the darkness Barnes represents. But even though Chris survives the war, he's not the same person who first arrived in Vietnam. The war has changed him forever. The ending is haunting. Chris is flown out of the jungle after a massive battle, but instead of feeling victorious, he's devastated. He reflects on how the war has torn his soul apart, saying, "We didn't fight the enemy, we fought ourselves, and the enemy was in us." That line sums up the entire movie. Platoon isn't just about Vietnam, it's about the internal battles we all face when confronted with violence, fear, and moral compromise. Oliver Stone's direction, combined with the amazing performances from the cast, makes Platoon feel so real and personal. It's not a glorified war movie. There's no romanticism or clear-cut heroes. It's gritty, tragic, and full of moral ambiguity. Stone really wanted to show the emotional and psychological toll of war, and he nails it.